Hi, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining me today with how we got here. Today, I'm looking to follow up on our discussions about race, but also look at some interesting stories on how Africans successfully resisted the transatlantic slave trade. So, as you know, I'm the facilitator, Joshua Garry, whatever you would like to call me. And then so far, we've looked at two things. We've looked at the presence of Africans in Britain. And we started with the Africans in Roman Britain. We have then looked at the Tudor, or the Africans in Tudor England. And we've also looked at the construction of race in terms of blackness and whiteness, and understanding that blackness and whiteness and race as we know it today primarily came from the transatlantic slave trade. And what I'm going to try and do in this lesson is to look at that a bit more, look at the impact of the transatlantic slave trade, the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade, but also how Africans consistently fought against it at every given opportunity that they had. Okay, what we learned about last week. So last week we've got a number of different images here. First, the image on the left, that looks at the triangular slave trade, the process of Europeans coming to Africa, trading in goods, taking those goods to the Americas, or taking the enslaved Africans to the Americas, and then taking those goods to Europe to sell. You have the image of the pyramids of TAST to the right, and the reason why the story of TAST was so important is, like we said last week, I believe this dynasty started roughly in 3400 BCE, for example, before the ancient Egyptians. And if you look at when the transatlantic slave trade started with Britain, which was roughly 1650, for example, and it ended in the 1830s, what that shows us is that the history of Africa is over 3,000 years, coming close to over 4,000 years. And the transatlantic slave trade at most lasted approximately 400 years. When you put 400 years next to 4,000 years, we start to understand how small, how tiny this period of history was in African history. Definitely a significant period, but a small period nonetheless. To the bottom left of me, we had the Elmina Fortress, which was, originally created as a place where Europeans could come and trade goods, and it eventually turned into a slaveholding fortress. But the story of Elmina is very, very interesting because it allows us to understand the power of Africans. At the time, the construction or the building of this fortress, the Europeans could only build it when they gained permission from the African kings, and very much so, the Europeans needed the support of the African kings. They didn't come into Africa and conquer. It was a gradual process which took over hundreds of years, but it very much started with Africans being the ones who very much dictated the terms and had the power. And finally, to the right, you have Dialogue. I find the story of Diallo rather challenging, but what it does, it introduces us to nuance. And you've got Diallo, who was from Senegal, who was originally involved in the transatlantic slave trade and selling enslaved Africans. He later became enslaved himself. He was freed. He went back to selling enslaved Africans, and he ended up falling back into the transatlantic slave trade. And that just picks up on the nuance of the transatlantic slave trade. It wasn't necessarily black and white. It wasn't simple. It's a very, very complicated and complex system. Now, today's session, what we're going to be focusing on is how did the enslaved Africans fight back, and what are the legacies of the transatlantic slave trade? And this is something I find really, really interesting, really. So, as I said, so last week I started off telling you a little bit about the story of Benin and how the Benin Empire originally refused to engage in the transatlantic slave trade. And I had a really, really interesting question last week, which I didn't have time to address, but it came back to me, and it was from someone of Nigerian descent. I'm Nigerian as well. I'm from a slightly different ethnic tribe for this person, but she was Yoruba. And she was told, and she asked me, Yoruba people, she was told that Yoruba people had been involved in enslaving and selling Africans. And what I wanted to say, and my answer to that was definitely at the very beginning, there were people who resisted. There were kingdoms who resisted the transatlantic slave trade, but there were also kingdoms who got involved in it. But as the slave trade continued, what ended up happening was, instead of trade in various forms, you know, for example, through wax, through gold, through copper, through horses, kingdoms only started trading with Europeans via slaves. And slavery went from a punishment to a motivation for war. And this was made even worse by the fact that Europeans gave African kingdoms guns. And what this did is it created instability, it created warfare, and it created by Africans were involved or started to get involved in selling people from similar demographics to themselves, because the pressures from the European countries meant that they had no other means of trading. And in order for these kingdoms to stay afloat, they started to, you started to have people from what would be modern day Nigeria, different ethnicities selling each other. And like I said, that story is very complex, and I never go down the line of Africans, South Africans. That's not something you're going to get from me. But what you will find is, as the slave trade grew, it became more difficult for these kingdoms to fight against them. And eventually they collapsed. And eventually slavery just became endemic. It became very ubiquitous, widespread. It was everywhere in Africa at the time. But my key story is resistance started from the very moment. I remember teaching the story of the transatlantic slave trade, and I remember my students saying, Mr. Garry, why did they fight back? Why did they accept it? Why did this happen? And it's a very complicated answer, but what I can give to you is that the Africans fought back from the very, very moment they were enslaved. And this is the crop. The crop to the right of me is the cassava crop. And I find it really interesting, especially if you're Nigerian or you're West African. You've probably eaten eba, you've probably eaten Garry. And I didn't know that this crop actually grew in popularity as a form of resistance. Now, the cassava crop is quite poor in terms of the nutrition it offers. But what the cassava crop allows is it allows somebody to plant it, run away into the forest, come back and take it out much later. And that was quite important, because one of the key ways of resisting enslavement was fleeing from the coast and going deeper into the forest. But if you go deep into the forest, you can't farm in the same way that you would usually farm. And so, as I said, they would plant the cassava veg crop. They'd leave it. When the coast was clear, when they were safe, they would come back and they'd now eat it. And I find that amazing, because I never knew that Garry, one of the main staples in the Nigerian community, was actually, in response or fighting against the transatlantic slave trade. Now, resistance in Africa, I love this story, and this story is amazing. So you've got a queen known as Nzinga Mbambe, and she was born in 1583, okay? And she was part of the Mbundu tribe, and it was part of the Kingdom of Congo, okay? But the Kingdom of Congo stretched to what is, today Angola as well, and I find her story absolutely remarkable. Nzinga Mbambe, she fought against the transatlantic slave trade from its very inception. And there was a time when she had to have a meeting with one of the Portuguese governors at the time, because she was not happy with what was happening in regards to the enslavement of Africans. And when she, upon reaching this meeting, when she got there, the Portuguese governor was sitting in a very, very high chair. And she was royal, but there was no high chair for her. The Portuguese governor didn't provide her any form of any stool. And he was doing it deliberately. He was doing it to be disrespectful. And what she decided to do, and what her soldiers with her decided to do, was form a chair for her. So instead of having her sit down on the ground and become, completely disrespected, her men formed a stool that brought her up to the level of her Portuguese governor where they could discuss. And the key reason why she wanted to discuss with the Portuguese governor was to stop the enslavement of Africans. She wasn't happy with the enslavement of Africans in the Kingdom of Congo, in the region of what is Angola, near Luanda. And at the time, the Portuguese governor, he agreed, but within 2 years, he went back on his deal. So what she did is she continually fought against the Portuguese to try and maintain the freedom of her people. She declared that her land would be free, which meant that there would be no slavery there. And she waged war against the Portuguese for the best part of 30 years. And she even formed an alliance with the Dutch to try and fight against the Portuguese. Now, unfortunately, she wasn't triumphant. The Portuguese still managed to secure victory and defeat the Kingdom of Congo. But this is one example of early resistance that started to take place. So the whole idea of enslaved Africans or Africans not fighting against the transatlantic slave trade is, rather false. You have the Oba Benin, you have the Queen Nzinga of the Kingdom of Congo, and you've also got the cassava plants as well. And these are, various different forms of resistance. However, resistance didn't just take place in Africa. I believe that the enslaved Africans resisted at almost every single point. There are a large amount of mutinies that would often occur on ships where, enslaved Africans would fight for their freedom, and, it would later result in people dying. And not only did you have mutinies on ships, which was quite interesting, Africans, especially from West Africa, took their traditions from Africa to the Americas and the New World. So countries like Cuba, Brazil, United States of America, a lot of the enslaved Africans there practice a number of their traditions. So for example, voodoo. When I grew up, I was always taught that, voodoo was this really, really evil thing. But what voodoo was, it was actually an attempt from the enslaved Africans to resist and fight against the religion that was forced upon themselves. Not only that, you had, even songs. I believe rap is a form of resistance, and hip hop and that whole language of resistance. It came out of the slave trade, and they always fought. But at the same time, what is clear and what we do need to get from this message is the transatlantic slave trade was upheld with terror, murder, and brutality. It wasn't a system that was kind. The punishments handed out to the enslaved Africans who tried to resist and fight against the slave masters were rather harsh, extremely harsh. And I was watching David Olusoga's documentary, and what is certain, you definitely had people or enslaved Africans continually fighting. But at some point, you also know that fight was beaten out of some of them through sheer terror. And that's something that I uphold. But I don't want to focus too much on that. I want to bring our attention to another really, really interesting story. Now, this story happens, a good couple of centuries after the transatlantic slave trade was abolished, but it is another example of Africans fighting against colonialism. Meet Yaa Asantewaa, and she was the queen mother of the Ashanti tribe in Ghana. Now, the British had kicked out, or they had exiled the King Prempeh I in 1896. And shortly afterwards, the British demanded the golden stool. Now, the golden stool was an ancestral power symbol. It's almost like, somebody invading the United Kingdom and asking for the royal crown. And Yaa Asantewaa was under no illusion. She was never, ever going to accept this. And I'm going to read what she said, which I was in awe when she said it. She said, "Now I see that some of you feared to go forward to fight for our king. Chiefs would not sit down to see their king taken away without firing a shot. Is it true that the bravery of Ashanti is no more? I cannot believe it. It cannot be. I must say this. If you, the men of Ashanti, will not go forward, then we will die. The women will. I shall call upon my fellow women and will fight the white men. We will fight till the last falls in the battlefield. Now, I find this story really, really interesting, and you're going to see a bit of a current theme through today's session. When we think about strength and power and bravery, we usually associate those ideas with men. We usually associate that with masculinity. And what I found was rather interesting was a number of the enslaved Africans who fought and who championed resistance were women. And I just think it's rather remarkable when we talk about what it means to be strong, what it means to be brave. This is captured in the African woman, and I find that to be really interesting. Now, Yaa Asante, she led the Ashanti Rebellion in the 1900s, and it lasted 2 years until she was captured and exiled. The Ashanti were eventually defeated by Britain, and they were conquered by Britain. But here's another example of how the Africans continue to fight. The enslaved Africans continue to fight against slavery, against colonialism, and against oppression in any form. And this is a picture that captures that battle or the rebellion between the Ashanti Kingdom and the British in the 1900s. And this is quite interesting because what you have the transatlantic slave trade, and transatlantic slave trade also ushered in or also allowed colonialism, and it allowed the British Empire to grow, something that a number of people for whatever reason are incredibly proud of. But what this shows, it shows how the British Empire, just like the transatlantic slave trade, was upheld through blood, through terror, and through murder. Now, we're moving on. So I've touched upon resistance in Africa. So we've looked at resistance in West Africa, we've looked at Angola, we've looked at Ghana, and we've looked at the cassava crop being or becoming a staple food as a means of fighting against and resisting the transatlantic slave trade. Now, in the New World, slavery or the resistance to slavery took place quite often. So in Jamaica, you had a society which developed, and these Jamaicans at the time were known as the Maroons. And the Maroons were warriors, and what they did is not only did they flee enslavement, they eventually set up communities for themselves in the hills, and they refused to accept enslavement. In countries such as Brazil, for example, they still practice African traditions, as I said. So Yoruba deities such as Shango are still worshipped in Brazil today. And you also had major revolts in 1816 and 1823. There were major revolts on plantations in Jamaica. Now, plantations were pretty much the places where enslaved Africans had to work, and they would often produce products such as sugar, such as tobacco, such as croydon, and sugar being the big one in the 1800s. But even at this point, you still had Africans, enslaved Africans, fighting against this. And in 1832, Samuel Sharp led a large revolt in Jamaica. Samuel Sharp was eventually captured and executed, and the revolt was eventually put down. But the key message that I've been able to get across is that enslaved Africans continue to fight, whether it be in Africa or whether it be in the New World, which I found to be very, very interesting. Now, you have one of the most successful, in fact, the only revolution that involved enslaved people fighting and freeing themselves. And this revolution was known as the Haitian Revolution, or back then it was known as Saint-Domingue. And I find this revolution to be fascinating. And yeah, it was the first anti-slavery and anti-colonial rebellion where the self-freed slaves were able to free themselves against what was France. Now, it began on the 22nd of August, 1719, and it ended in 1804. And it involved blacks. At the time, they were known as mulattoes. So these were mixed race people, French, Spanish, British participants, and it was one of the key leaders was an ex-slave named Toussaint Louverture. And what I find rather remarkable about this revolt or this rebellion, once the enslaved freed themselves, and when Haiti became, or Haiti as it's called, managed to become a free country, and at the time you need to understand that Haiti was probably the most valuable colony because it produced so much sugar. They abolished slavery immediately, so the enslaved Africans immediately abolished slavery. Slavery never returned, and this is what I found really interesting, and this really challenges our concept of race. In the Constitution, because you had Europeans who also fought with the Haitian rebels, they said any person who fought with the Haitian leaders legally became black. And that's interesting, because when we look at the construction of race and when we understand how, you know, just how fake it is really, there's one race, there's a human race. It's interesting to see that how people who were involved in fighting against the French, white people who were involved in fighting against the French, legally became black. And that was in their constitution. And that's something to know. And it also led to the creation of a country free from slavery. And it is widely seen as a significant moment in the history against racism, in the history supporting equal rights, and the history of democracy. Ideas of liberty, which is freedom, were seen to be very important in, you know, the Haitian Revolution. And I always like talking about really, really cool, incredible stories. And I have to bring your attention to Sanet Belair. And she was one of the leaders during the revolution. And legend has it that, you know, she was caught, her and her husband were caught, and her and her husband were about to be executed. And once again, I love these stories because they really, 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 really challenge our ideas of masculinity. Legend has it that, you know, before they're about to be executed, her husband was crying, and she told him, get up, slapped him, and said, do you not know how sweet it is to die for liberty? Stand up. And just imagine that. Once again, you have an image of a man and a woman. You would expect the man to be brave. You would expect the man to be strong. But what you had is this amazing story of Sanet Belair, who tells her husband to stand up and says, look, how sweet it is to die for liberty. And I thought that was amazing. And yeah, so I really, really hone in on it, but it's the only country in human history where enslaved people overthrew their government and became the government themselves. It's the only country where the Polish and German soldiers who fought alongside the Haitians became legally black. And that shows us how fragile this concept of race really is. And I had to bring your attention to one of the key leaders at the time, Toussaint Louverture. And Toussaint Louverture was one of the most, well, he was the leader of the Haitian Revolution, but the Haitian Revolution was also significant because it led to remarkable change. The plantation owners at the time became increasingly frightened at the possibility of more slave results. They were frightened by this. And quite often, when they had discussions in Parliament around the idea of abolition, this was usually followed by revolts. And in this, we can see how central the actions of enslaved Africans were to the fight to abolish the transatlantic slave trade. When I was taught about the transatlantic slave trade, I was taught about William Wilberforce, who certainly did great things, but the central role of Africans was not included. And that's something that I think is rather important to share. Now, we've looked at resistance in Africa. We've looked at resistance in the New World. And it's quite important to know what resistance in Britain looked like. Now, the picture on the left of me is somebody called Olaudah Equiano, very, very significant. Now, Olaudah Equiano, he was from Benin, which is in modern day Nigeria. And he was enslaved. He was enslaved and he was taken to the New World. And he eventually gained his freedom. He worked hard and he gained his freedom. And when he gained his freedom, he went on a personal mission to communicate. He wrote a very, very famous book where he was able to show the people in Britain the horrors of slavery. And that was quite important because in Britain, or in England, should I say Britain, you did have slaves, but you didn't have plantations. So quite often, the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade weren't readily apparent to the people who lived in Britain. And moreover, most of the enslaved Africans that you had come over to Britain were usually brought over as a result of, you know, a plantation owner might have been on holiday and he might have brought some of his slaves over with him to the UK. So you didn't have the plantations that you had in America. And I think it's one of the reasons why Britain have found it so easy to distance itself from the transatlantic slave trade. But the fact is, they're involved. But bringing back to Olaudah Equiano, what I found really interesting. So Olaudah Equiano, he formed a group with somebody called Otuba Kugano. So Otuba Kugano, he was from Ghana, and Olaudah Equiano was from Benin. And these two previously enslaved men, enslaved Africans, worked together to form the abolition group Sons of Africa. And they campaigned against the abolition of slavery. And I think this is amazing because way before Pan-Africanism became something that was popular, you had Africans from 2 different countries coming together to fight for the greater good. And this was important. It allowed people to see that slaves were real people. They were not property. And that was a very, very significant and important thing. Just waiting for my video to move on. Okay, now, we know by 1807, the tide in Britain had changed. You know, morally, Britain had reached a place or come to the acceptance that the transatlantic slave trade was abhorrent. And they abolished the transatlantic slave trade. However, slavery did not end, okay? And this was rather difficult in the Americas, and it contributed to the American Civil War. You had those in the North who wanted to abolish slavery and felt that the country needed to move on. And you also had those in the South who were very much supporters of slavery and felt that it benefited them. Now, as we know, war leads to an increase in prices. And during the American Revolution, you had situations where cotton, sugar, all of these products that came from the Americas became very, very expensive and very difficult to get hold of. Now, this story is important because it impacted people living in England. The factories that we had during the Industrial Revolution, the cotton that was used in these factories came from the Americas. The tobacco came from the Americas. The sugar came from the Americas. And if there was a war, and if no products were moving from the Americas to the United Kingdom, that would ultimately mean that there was no work. White working class people would have no means of funds. And you had outcry. There are people in Liverpool who are clearly upset because it's a day-to-day income. But there's a rather remarkable story that I love, and it's about an anti-slavery town, the anti-slavery town of Rochdale. Now, Rochdale was a town with white working class British people that had many workers who were reliant on the cotton from the US for work. If the cotton from the United States did not reach them, they wouldn't have a job. And to bring that to simple terms, if you don't have a job, you can't buy food, you can't pay your rent, you can't live. However, in spite of the economic problems, the immediate problems it caused them, and the fact that, to be honest, it'd probably be in their interest to support the South, they went against it. The men and women in all these mill towns during the worst months decided to support the anti-slavery movement. And they said those enslaved Africans in the Americas have a much harder time than we have. And whatever we can do to support them, we will do so. And I think that's a really, really interesting story. The fact that the people of Rochdale supported the enslaved Africans and were a key part in the fight against slavery, even though it went against their immediate interests. And that's something that's very important for us to hold on to. You would have people from all over who would fight against the transatlantic slave trade. And now, this moves us on to our next question. What is the legacy of the slave trade? What were the consequences? What did it leave behind? How did the transatlantic slave trade impact on Britain economically? How did it impact on Britain socially? How did it impact on Africa? What were the issues, or shall I say, the problems that came about as a result of the transatlantic slave trade? So, it was rather complicated. When the slave trade was abolished, this did not mean, first and foremost, that slavery ended immediately. It did not end immediately, okay? Most of them had to remain working on the same plantations for a period of time, which I'll let you know about shortly. If they were paid, they were often paid very, very low wages, and they were charged very, very high rates for poor quality housing. In the Americas, they were known as sharecroppers, people who would still farm for next to nothing and pay, a lot of money. And other former slaves who eventually gained their freedom would have to move with their families to new regions and start completely from scratch. So that already paints a rather interesting picture. Even though slavery was abolished, the enslaved Africans still started from the bottom. And this is going to be very interesting when you look at how it affected other people in certain ways. And another key issue you had from the transatlantic slave trade was the idea of race and racism. We understand that racism is wrong, but it came about during the transatlantic slave trade, and I would almost identify the Barbados slave codes as the point where racism really started to take root. And basically what happened in these slave codes is the enslaved Africans were reduced from human beings to property. And when they were reduced from human beings to property, the white people, on the other hand, stopped seeing them as humans. They stopped seeing them as equal. And as we've seen, prior to the transatlantic slave trade, these ideas were not necessarily mainstream. And I guess the question you'd ask yourself is why? Why did this happen? During this period, some Europeans struggled with the idea of the enslavement of Africans. And so they had to use religion to justify it. But ultimately, it was all about money. The enslaved blacks would work in the Americas, and their children would become the property of the plantation owners. And what that provided free labor. And the lands in the Americas, and the Caribbean, such as Barbados, Jamaica, the southern states in America, they needed to be farmed. And slavery's economic need gave way to racial ideas. And I guess the question you ask yourself is, if this happened in the 18th and 19th century, how does it affect us now? Now, there were issues or ideas that became very widespread during the transatlantic slavery. The idea that, Black people are violent, Black people are lazy. And what happens? If these ideas aren't challenged, people grow up with these ideas. And then you have situations where police officers have been raised with the idea that Black people are violent. And so when they approach Black people, they approach them in a more violent manner. And they're more likely to increase their stop and search policy on them. And even when you look at laziness, for example, if Africans or if people are raised with the idea that African people are lazy, then employers are not going to choose them. They're going to choose other people, even though they are clearly capable. And that is one of the key reasons why you cannot start with the transatlantic slave trade in Africa. You can't start with it during the transatlantic slave trade. It's why you need to start in Africa, because these ideas only came into existence because of the transatlantic slave trade, all of these negative ideas. And we need to completely get rid of these ideas. So, as we said, another significant legacy of I've touched upon racism, which is important. And now the fight for equality. Racism and economic inequality between Black and white people were significant legacies of slavery, but there are many more. Black people often had little political power once they gained freedom. They had limited legal rights and they had poor access to education. Freedom from slavery was a major success, but it was also the start of a new battle, the fight for equality, which we're still fighting today. Now, this is where, for me, it gets rather interesting, and I didn't know this, and it's really going to challenge people. And I know some people who are listening are economists or economists, they really, really care about the numbers. Now, in order for the British government to abolish slavery, they agreed to compensate slave owners with £20 million. That's the equivalent of roughly 16.5 or 17.5 billion pounds today. The government agreed to bail these people out of 17.5 billion pounds today. And the only modern day equivalent that comes to my mind would be the market crash, the '08 market crash, where the government bailed out the banks. Now, even in order to get to this point, it was really, really interesting, because you had the abolitionists and you had the pro-slavery argument. And, you know, by the 1820s, so to speak, I believe that morally the abolitionists had already clearly won that. They'd already clearly won the argument that slavery was going to be, you know, slavery was bad. However, what the pro-slavery people were able to argue is ultimately that they were losing property. And the issue is the slave codes legally made enslaved Africans property. And property is a very, very sacred or important value to the English system. So the pro-slavery people or the pro-slavery group argued for compensation. And this was a really, really difficult point for the abolitionists, because they knew that in order for slavery to be abolished in the 1830s, a payment would have to be paid. But in order to concede, for a short time, they'd have to accept that enslaved Africans were property and not human. This was difficult because it completely went against their key argument that these people are humans. I just thought that's rather interesting. And so, as I said, when slavery was eventually abolished in the 1834, enslaved Africans also had to agree to something known as an apprenticeship. So if the enslaved Africans worked in agriculture or the farm, they had to work for 6 years for free. And if they worked as domestic servants, or they worked in the house, they still had to work for 4 years for free before they could enjoy their freedom. So what we've got here is a system where, in order to abolish slavery, firstly, the slave plantation owners were paid money to do so. And some of them became very wealthy, and I'm going to shine light on a story that will really, really challenge us. But not only did these people become wealthy, slaves had to continue working for a number of years for free. And that just shows in itself that the process to freedom wasn't straightforward. It wasn't simple. And who benefited from the transatlantic slave trade? And there's one story that I find you guys are probably tired of me, you're saying, Josh, how many stories do you find fascinating? But this story of George Hibbert and the Hibbert family, it's remarkable. So their story starts roughly in the 1600s. And when their story starts, they're nothing more than cloth merchants. So they're involved in selling cloth. So when the Europeans first went to West Africa, you would trade cloth for gold, for example. Don't get into the economics of it, but they did. Now, the Hibberts originally started in Manchester. Okay, so in the 1650s, they were cloth merchants in Manchester. Today, they are part of the aristocracy through marriage. And as a result of being slave owners and being a part of the plantations, they were able to grow economically, socially, and physically from the transatlantic slave trade. Now, their story is rather unique. I cannot say that it's representative of all the stories, but it gives us an interesting insight nonetheless. You had members of the Hibbert family who became MPs. You had members of the Hibbert families who became judges. You had members of the Hibbert family who became sheriffs, the previous form of policemen. You had members of the Hibbert family who contributed money to education. And when people say institutional racism doesn't exist, I think it's quite interesting. We've got somebody or people from the Hibbert family who directly benefited from the transatlantic slave trade, right? Who were involved in Britain at a time, or England at a time of when we were coming together as a nation. And they're involved in things such as making laws, such as how the financial city would work. These ideas, whether conscious or unconscious, would affect laws, and those laws and those systems contribute to institutional racism. Now, a little bit more about the Hibbert family. So the Hibbert family, they were part of a team who invested in the West India Docks, okay? Now, the West India Docks is where Canary Wharf is today, and I think they invested a sum of approximately 2 million. I could be wrong. They invested a rather large amount in that part of London, and that became the financial hub. Also, from the compensation scheme, the Hibbert family inherited approximately £80 million. They married into successful or aristocratic families. Not only did they marry into aristocratic families, they bought amazing property. So I know there's a Payne's property. It's where quite a few people want to get married. Me and my partner were going to get married there at one point, and the Hibbert family were a part of that. And with the Hibbert family, you are able to see how a family who started off in Manchester as cloth traders were able to climb to the very, very top echelons of society, where they started in Manchester, they had a financial office in London, they had plantations in America, they became judges, they became MPs, they married into aristocracy, and this is just one story. I want to talk a bit more about them because I thought I put something else on the other slide. And something else that I found rather interesting about the Hibbert family was who they worked with. So companies such as Lloyd's Banking, Barclays Banking, they have connections to the transatlantic slave trade. They invested in the transatlantic slave trade. You had people from the Bank of England who worked in the Bank of England who also invested in the transatlantic slave trade. Insurance became very profitable. And what you're starting to see is the finances from the transatlantic slave trade seeping into British society. You have cities such as Bristol, Liverpool, Glasgow, and London, which are built off the bricks of the transatlantic slave trade. The Hibbert family invested in railway networks, and they started to see connection. Now, I read this book by Joseph Inekori, and it's tough, but he's an African historian, and basically he suggests that the slave trade allowed the Industrial Revolution to happen. And he simply believes that British factories benefited by supplying goods used in factories such as cotton in exchange for slaves, and that profits made in the transatlantic slave trade were invested in Britain. In a simple term, what he's saying is the things that the slaves worked on, or the products that the slaves worked on in the Americas and plantations, they provided work for people in the factories. And the wealth that was gained from the transatlantic slave trade was invested back into the country. And as we've seen with the Hibbert family, this was the case. Now, when looking at the act on Africa, there's an argument that the slave trade ruined Africa because of the constant wars and the loss of millions of strong young people. These strong young people could have been future doctors, they could have been future engineers, they could have been future farmers. And the constant wars created a cycle of violence and warfare in Africa that still exists today. And what is more, the transatlantic slave trade impacted Africa in terms of gender demographics. The majority of the enslaved people were males. And what that meant that people couldn't farm. That meant that soldiers weren't able to protect Africa, and it allowed colonialism to come in. Historian Walter Rodney, he studied it, and he pretty much argues that the transatlantic slave trade was what led to the underdevelopment of Africa. Now, who was impacted more? It was said by historian Peter Fryer, who, as you know from my first session, I'm a major fan of. He said, every brick in a city in Liverpool and Bristol had been cemented with slaves' blood. The wealth generated transformed cities like Bristol, Liverpool, Glasgow, and London into boom towns. So we've already seen economically how it's impacted, and we're starting to see politically how it's impacted. And in Africa, the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade in Africa, slavery became the goal of warfare. What used to happen is if two rival tribes would go to war with each other, the victims were put into enslavement. And even when they were put into slavery, the concept of slavery was very, very different to the European transatlantic slave trade. Okay? However, what started happening was Europeans started to fund Africans with guns. The Africans with guns would go and try and hunt slaves to sell to Europeans. And what this started was a vicious cycle that still affects Africa to this day. And this dependency on the transatlantic slave trade ultimately meant that some of the African kingdoms collapsed. And this left them open to European colonialism. And this is simply the direct or indirect rule by European countries. As I pointed out, so slavery left a major gender imbalance. You had a lot more African males going and being enslaved than African females, okay? At this time, you need to understand that it was important because African males were the ones who were predominantly responsible for farming, for example, for developing the country. And this meant that famine became a major problem in the continent. I don't like to use the word country. In order to avoid the transatlantic slave trade, as I mentioned earlier, families would run into the forests. They would flee the coast. And this just meant that the African land wasn't developed. And as I said, major financial institutions have connections to the transatlantic slave trade and they benefited from it. Barclays being one of them. And as we said, by the late 19th century, European involvement in Africa was at its peak. Yes, the transatlantic slave trade was coming to an end, but Africa no longer had soldiers to defend themselves because a number of their soldiers were enslaved. This left Africa open. And in 1884, at the Conference of Berlin, the leaders of Europe agreed to divide Africa between themselves. Africans had no say in this matter whatsoever. And these divisions ignored the ethnic makeup of different sections. And this created further instability that exists till this day. And Nigeria is an amazing example. In Nigeria, you have so many different tribes. You have the Igbo, you have the Yoruba, you have the Hausa, myself, I'm Ijo. You have the Efik, you have so many different tribes that existed in Nigeria, that exist in Nigeria at this time. These tribes have different beliefs, different identities, different customs. But forcing these tribes to live in one country creates a level of friction and tension that still plagues this country to today. Still has a major divide and conquer. Now, my closing thoughts. I'm going to give you some closing thoughts, and I believe I may have some time to have some discussions. And my closing thoughts come from Steve BIKO of South Africa. He was a revolutionary thinker, and it's such a shame that we didn't really get to benefit from him. And these thoughts came from a teacher. I read her blog on Twitter, and it goes a little something like this. A people without a history is like a vehicle without an engine. They'll always live in the shadow of a more successful society. That already captures the importance of teaching African history. They, white people, should act as lubricating material so that as blacks change the gear of trying to find a better direction for South Africa, there should be no grinding of noise or metal, but a free and easy movement which would be characteristic of a well-looked after vehicle. And I love this because what this says is white people are part of this change as well. And in a similar way, listen, I don't have the authority to do this, but in a similar way where you had Polish and Germans supporting the Haitian Revolution and they legally became black, they were important in that struggle. And this struggle is not a struggle just for black people. It's a change that needs the whole of society to be involved in. My closing thoughts. It is important to teach such history for 3 reasons to me. Black British people are more likely to engage with the past if they can see where they fit in the narrative. And this can act as a real fuel for empowerment. As I said, I'm Nigerian, I've always been Nigerian, but when I was 7 years old, I said I was Bayesian. I love my Bayesian people and no disrespect to them. But I said that because the images of Africa that I was constantly shown on the TV left me nothing proud of. All I would ever see is famine. I'll see children with bloated stomachs and just living in complete destitution, complete poverty. And, you know, there are areas in Africa where that does occur, but there's such a rich history. Racism can end with teaching. If students, both black and white, become aware of the cultures and history that existed, the misconception that white Europeans were always ahead can be challenged. And so the bedrock for racism can be removed. A balanced and inclusive history of Britain can truly be studied. Diverse voices can be heard, and difficult periods can be understood in their full complexity and nuance. Maybe then we can truly call ourselves Great Britain. And just some advice for teachers, really. A number of my resources were found on the West African Kingdom's website, and this website was created by Dr. Toby Green. Amazing. He's a lecturer at King's College London University, and you've got so many teaching aids, but this isn't just for teachers, even just regular parents. You can go onto this website and you can find all kinds of really, really interesting stories and facts about African history. And these are some of the books and resources that I used. I know that last week, for example, a number of people contacted the Region Higher team. And yeah, I just thought I should share a bit with you. So the Black African Empires is written by somebody called Dan Linden, who I have the pleasure of working with. And a number of my ideas come from this. And this is really impressive because it can be read by children. And I remember I actually paid my niece my niece is in year 7. I paid her £5 to read it and she loved it. So for parents at home, you can read this and very, very simple, easy to digest. And it gives us loads of the powerful stories about African kingdoms and African empires. You've got Black and British, A Forgotten History by David Olashuga. I love it. Watch the TV series, only 4 episodes. I watched it on BBC iPlayer. I've also read the book, and a lot of my stories and a lot of my information come from this book. This book is gold standard. It's gold dust. Doing justice to history, once again, for teachers. And that whole question, did Europeans become involved in the slave trade because they are racist, or did slavery make Europeans racist? That question came from that book. And it's, for secondary school teachers, really, really important. And then finally, Legacies of British Slave Ownership. This is a book I have, thanks to Region Higher. And some of the the professors involved, Nick Draper and Katie Donington, I worked with them whilst I was doing my, my fellowship. And it's really interesting because this is where stories like the story of George Hibbert can be found. And moving on, and this is where it gets a bit more challenging. The UCL, University College of London, in connection with Nick Draper and Kate Johnson, I've created a database. And basically, with this database, you can research the legacies of the transatlantic slave trade. You can find which houses in your local area were owned by plantation owners, but you can even look at it and put your family's name in and find out how far your family's history traces back, or whether your family were involved in the transatlantic slave trade. Now, next week, we'll be concentrating on the contribution of Black Britain. So I'm going to pick up from the Tudors, and I'm going to look at, the Georgians, the Victorians, and trying to look at the First World War and Second World War, so we can get a better idea of how Black people have contributed to British society, and why I believe Black British history is British history, because at almost every key moment, you'll find the contribution of Black British people there. Okay, so we've got about 7. Okay, so you've got that. Follow, these are the teachers on Twitter to follow. We've got about 7 minutes, so I'm going to answer some questions for the next 7 minutes, which should be fun. But yeah, let me see if I could quickly answer these questions for the next 7 minutes. If anyone knows the Man United score, please tell me that as well, please. I hope we won. Okay. Go to the top. I'm from Brazil, Cassava and Garry. Yeah, I love that. Asante sounds amazing. What is heartbreaking, if I'm right, is that it is this success that made Haiti so vulnerable today. They have never been able to claim reparations from. Yeah, that's it's true. And the total sum represented 40% of the government's yearly income in those days, equivalent to some. Oh, are you talking about the reparations? Yeah, well, like I said, around about figure was 17.5 billion today, and I think we only just stopped paying that. So yeah, thank you, Jamie. I'm happy you get something from these stories. yeah, it wasn't fair. Yep, he paid it until 2015. Well, yeah, exploit. Yeah, this was a tough one. Is there any questions though? Oh, maybe there are a number of companies where if you research deeper, you'd find some rather disturbing connections. Yeah, thank you for the promotion. I know Daryl, we worked together on the Black Tudors project. Go on his tour. He's awesome guy, really, really good. So to be honest, with Key Stage 1 pupils, I wouldn't engage in the slave trade, I'll be honest. I would look at, so you've got on BBC Bitesize, you have ancient Egypt, you also have the Benin Kingdom. So those would be two African kingdoms I would look at. So you've got the Benin, you've got BBC Bitesize. Also look at the Toby Green website I showed you, and you've got all the African kingdoms there. But I wouldn't engage in the teaching of the transatlantic slave trade to students in Key Stage 1 in the same way where you wouldn't teach a Holocaust. It's rather heavy stuff. Yes, Rochelle, you will be getting books. The situation around the books is quite simply this: we are waiting to the end. Those people who have signed up to every single session will have those books sent out to them. And thank you, Nikki, for saying that. The Black and British series is good. The African King website, Nikki asked me to put it up, so I promise I will send that to her. Any questions? Will the slides be available anywhere? I don't know. They might do. I'll speak to Region Higher about that. Senate Belair. Good question. I believe you could, if you read Akala's book Natives, it says a bit more about her. And also Akala did a talk on her. So if you YouTube Akala's talk on her, you can find out more. Is there any more? Well, I don't know how much they did contribute to the fight against slavery and racism, but I do know, for example, in the situation in Haiti, they did, and I also know in the Empire Windrush, the ship that docked in Tilbury in 1948, you had some Polish people on that ship as well. But I think the main thing, to my understanding, Western Europe was so far more advanced technologically at the time and geographically as well. The position of Western Europe and Africa meant that it was just easier to be involved in that, to be involved in the trade. Thank you, Hannah. It was tough, but that's why I started with Africa last week. Was the Church of it? You definitely. I don't know if they were directly involved, but you certainly had ministers who were involved. No, slaves did not get paid any compensation. They had to work for free. Who? The Hibbert family. You've got this book here. So Legacies of British Slave Ownership. There's a chapter dedicated to the Hibberts. But also if you go to the UCL site, you can find out about 2 minutes, but slightly, 1 minute, slightly controversial, but are there stories about what situation made way for people staying in West Africa and not being part of the slave trade when in conflicts? Thank you. Great question, Janie. You had situations, like I said, where, I don't know about specific stories, but you had situations where people would flee and go into forests, the type of food they ate. But to be honest, I don't know of any clear things off the top of my head, because the instability that, the guns and the violence caused meant that whole region was really, really badly affected and still affected today. What is the question? Have you mentioned a few slaves who were able to become free as one of cases? Oh, Elado Equiano. I believe he worked, and I don't want to give you the wrong information, so let me find out, because I can't remember whether he worked and paid it or he fled, but I'll find out and let you know. Should companies who were involved in the slave trade be held accountable? I don't know. I don't know if they should be held accountable today. I don't know. But thank you for everyone for, being a part of this session. Sorry if I haven't, answered any moral questions, but at least I'm going to try my best to give the history to you. Tough session, I know, but ultimately we should learn about the legacies from that. Thank you very much. Have a lovely evening. Goodbye.